Welcome to Creative Housing Approaches that leverage the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services housing resources. This breakout session is brought to you by the DBHDS Office of Community Housing. Here's our agenda for today's breakout session. We're going to cover 3 creative housing approaches tonight, including live-in aids, shared housing, and family-owned rental housing. For each of these approaches, we'll provide you some real-life examples, and then at the end, we'll open the lines so that we can engage in some question and answers. So let's dive right in. First, let's talk about live-in aids. Now, what is a live-in aid exactly? A live-in aid is an individual who is essential to the care and well-being of a person with a disability. Now, a live-in aid is not obligated for the support of the person with a disability, and they would not live in the unit except to provide necessary support services to enable the person to use their housing. And last but not least, a live-in aid is not a parent, grandparent, guardian, or spouse. So a live-in aid essentially lives with a person in rental housing through a rental assistance program. And if the live-in aid is either fired or no longer needed, the live-in aid is going to have to leave the unit. Also, if a person with a disability who is the head of household moves or passes away, the live-in aid is not going to be entitled to any rent subsidy or to take over the lease. So, people often ask, how can I add my live-in aid to my household in the Housing Choice Voucher or State Rental Assistance Program? Well, the first step is to request what we call a reasonable accommodation from the housing program, like the voucher program or State Rental Assistance Program. Now, a reasonable accommodation is basically an exception to the housing program's rules that assures equal access to housing for a person with a disability. There are many types of reasonable accommodations that a person with a disability might ask for in the voucher or state rental assistance program to make it easier for them to access and use both the rental assistance program and the housing they get through the rental assistance program. And a live-in aid is just one of those reasonable accommodations. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits and disadvantages of having a live-in aid. Well, the first benefit is that the individual and family can choose somebody that they trust to be their live-in aid. This is not a service or a waiver service, but instead, again, it's an exception to the housing program's rules. But because it's the housing program's accommodation, that means the individual and family is responsible for choosing the person who will live with them, and that person has to be approved by the rent assistance program. So they can choose whoever they believe is going to provide them that essential care and support that they need to be able to use their housing effectively. The live-in aid will get his or her own bedroom at no extra cost to the individual. So part of granting this accommodation means that the housing program is going to make the subsidy bigger to be able to cover a larger unit, both for the individual and for a separate bedroom for the live-in aid. The individual can leverage waiver service supports like consumer-directed personal assistance, or they can leverage supports that are provided through a private pay arrangement with a certain service provider. So this means that if you have a person who has a live-in aid and that live-in aid gets paid by the waiver, that attendant, that live-in aid is going to get paid through the waiver and get free rent for living with the person. So that's a pretty good side benefit in addition to getting the regular wages. The benefit to the individual is that the individual is going to have somebody who's present overnight and can provide care in the night hours as well as at bookends of the day. that care may be in addition to their authorized waiver or privately paid hours. Now, there are some disadvantages, so it's important to go in eyes wide open. One of the disadvantages is the same as the benefit. The individual has to identify and secure the live-in aid. This is not something, a service that a support coordinator is going to refer you for, and it's not a service that the housing program will provide to connect you with a live-in aid. So individuals and families will have to do a little footwork to be able to identify somebody that they trust and make an arrangement to have that person be their live-in aid. Another disadvantage is that sometimes it's hard to find new live-in aids, especially when there's turnover. So you have to be careful and have a backup plan. So if your live-in aid who lives with you now leaves, you know how you're going to handle that perhaps gap in time when you don't have a live-in aid staying with you. So it's important to be able to plan for those situations. Last but not least, it's important to understand that when an individual receives an accommodation from a housing program to be able to have a live-in aid, then that individual is engaging that live-in aid to provide a service or support. By engaging that live-in aid to provide services, that individual or family may become an employer under fair labor laws, and they may be subject to both labor and tax laws. So, how does the whole live-in aid situation work? Well, the individual and family first, as we mentioned before, has to identify someone who agrees to be a live-in aid. And it's really helpful to make sure that that live-in aid's roles and responsibilities are clearly defined. And we strongly suggest it's a best practice to create a written agreement with your live-in aid that outlines, for example, his or her care responsibilities, weekly work schedule, payment for services, and any terms for dismissal. The next step after you've identified someone is to go ahead and request that reasonable accommodation from the Housing Choice Voucher or SRAP program. Part of requesting an accommodation involves explaining what the person's disability-related need is to have a live-in aid. Why, because of their disability, can they not live by themselves and they need extra support who's going to live with them to provide essential care. And then you also have to provide or get a third party's verification of that disability-related need for the live-in aid. So that third party might be a doctor, a psychiatrist, service provider, or support coordinator that will put in writing why that individual really does need this live-in aid. If approved for a reasonable accommodation, the individual and/or his or her family may be considered an employer and must comply with applicable labor laws, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act. Live-in home aides are considered live-in home care workers under the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. This means live-in aides have certain wage protections in an employment relationship. Now, different parties could be the employer of a live-in aide depending on the circumstances. These parties include the individual or his or her family, a provider agency, or the individual or family and a provider agency in a joint employment relationship. The Fair Labor Standards Act has special rules regarding how live-in home care workers are compensated in terms of minimum wage and overtime wages. In general, individuals and/or families who employ a live-in home care worker must pay at least minimum wage. However, the individual or family employer is exempt from paying overtime wages. Under certain circumstances, exemptions from minimum wage may even apply. However, if an agency solely or jointly employs a live-in home care worker, the agency must pay at least minimum wage and overtime wages. If an individual receives a rent subsidy from the Housing Choice Voucher Program or State Rental Assistance Program, the rent subsidy pays for the live-in caregiver's rent and utilities. This means the employer incurs no cost for the live-in caregiver's housing, so the employer cannot credit housing costs toward wages. Any wages owed to the live-in caregiver must be paid in full. Finally, it's important to know who the employer is if the live-in aid is paid cash wages, because the employer may have to withhold Social Security and Medicare taxes from the paycheck, report wages and file federal tax returns, and pay federal and state unemployment taxes. For more information about employment responsibilities when engaging a live-in aid, please see the Department of Labor's website, including their home care guide, and the ARC of Northern Virginia's website, which features a live-in care attendant guide. Or, if you have a very unique circumstance and would like some additional technical assistance, contact your DBHDS Regional Housing Coordinator. So now let's look at an example. Let's consider Pete. Pete is on the DD waiver wait list, and he received a one-time special admissions housing choice voucher from Arlington County. Pete requested a reasonable accommodation for a live-in aid with the help of his parents and his support coordinator. He then moved into a tax credit property. Now, the property Pete moved to doesn't have a leasing preference for people with developmental disabilities, but the property takes vouchers, so he was able to rent there anyway. Pete retained a live-in aide named Chris, and Chris helps keep Pete on schedule to go to work in the morning. He prompts Pete to clean the apartment and do his laundry. He takes Pete shopping, and together Chris and Pete make meals together and socialize. Pete's family pays Chris a small stipend to cover the weekly hours that he works, and that stipend equates to at least minimum wage. So that's live-in aids as a creative housing approach. It's a great way to be able to stretch your housing dollars and help cover a little bit of the cost of what it may be to have somebody live with you to provide additional supports as needed. Now let's talk about shared housing. So what is shared housing? Shared housing essentially is a house that is shared by several renters, where each renter has a separate rental agreement. Each rents a bedroom and shared common space, and the renters receive general supports from someone known as a resident assistant. Now, with the separate leases, each resident has a separate lease with their landlord for a bedroom and use of the common area in the dwelling. Those leases are typically 12 months long, but they might revert to a month-to-month status after the initial 12-month term. In shared housing, landlords may charge a security deposit and or a non-refundable holding fee for the unit to be rented or space to be rented, and the landlords will generally cover the utilities in the rent. It's important to note that in those leases, tenants are typically responsible for lawn care, housekeeping, cable, internet, and phone. And the residents, with the help of their families, may contract for lawn care and housekeeping and split the cost, or they may split the cost of cable, internet, and phone. But if one resident leaves, it's important to note that the other residents will have to pick up any cost differences for things like lawn care, housekeeping, etc., until another resident joins the arrangement. Now, let's talk about that resident assistant. The resident assistant typically has a month-to-month lease agreement with the landlord to occupy a bedroom and a shared common space for reduced or no rent in exchange for providing informal supports to the other renters. The lease agreement specifies that occupancy is contingent upon the performance of certain duties, and if the resident assistant fails to provide those agreed upon informal supports, perform those duties, the lease may be terminated with proper notice, such as 30 days. A lease addendum outlines the supports that the resident assistant must provide, along with a general schedule. Examples of informal supports might include being a role model for independent living, such as modeling hygiene, chores and laundry, meal preparation, things like that. It might also involve facilitating social interaction around meal times, and coming and going from the home. It may be involving encouraging residents to participate in social activities or performing check-ins on residents to make sure that they are healthy and functioning all right. And if they need help with certain things, for example, maybe with their electronics or getting directions to go to a certain activity, the resident assistant can help prompt in that manner. If the resident assistant notices that somebody hasn't been out of their room for a while or seems to not be feeling well, the resident assistant can let the family know if there's a concern. Resident assistants may be responsible for reviewing mail for bills to be paid, like the cable, internet, or phone bill, and they'll let the appropriate party know. They'll possibly be providing chore reminders, such as doing the dishes, taking out the trash, and they might be reporting maintenance issues to the landlord, performing routine preventive maintenance like putting batteries in smoke detectors or changing filters, things like that. Now, please note, the resident assistant does not provide direct care or support with activities of daily living, skills training, or housekeeping. These more direct and intensive supports must be provided through other means. So, what are the key ingredients for shared housing? Well, the first ingredient is you have to have 2 to 3 people who would like to live together. And those 2 to 3 people may need 2 to 3 families who are supportive and willing to assist with things like the ancillary housing costs, like the lawn care or the phone bill or the cable bill, things like that. They're also willing to provide the legwork to put supports in place that may be including the resident assistant. And they have to be willing to work with the landlord to make sure that the individuals are able to comply with the lease and meet their obligations. The third ingredient is a resident assistant who provides informal supports. Now, this is usually a college student and is usually identified by the families that are assisting the individuals to put together this arrangement. Last but not least, the fourth ingredient is a landlord who is willing to manage separate leases with each resident in a condo or a single-family residence. The landlord will execute those leases with the renters with disabilities and a different lease with the resident assistant, containing all of the requirements we discussed previously. So, we often get asked, can you use housing choice vouchers or state rental assistance in shared housing arrangements? And the answer is yes, for the most part. So the state rental assistance program permits shared housing automatically. So that's an option that people have if they would like to pursue it. However, not all housing choice vouchers permit shared housing. So it's really important to check with your local program first and make sure that that's an arrangement that they can support. Assuming that they can support it, here are the requirements for using either SRAP or a housing choice voucher in a shared housing arrangement. First, the renter's private space and common spaces will have to pass a safety inspection. Next, the renter is going to be responsible for paying 30% of his or her monthly adjusted income toward the rent. That's called the tenant rent contribution. Third, the maximum subsidy for a renter with a housing choice voucher or SRAP will typically be the pro rata share of the payment standard for the dwelling. The payment standard is the maximum allowable subsidy that can be put into a residence. So in this case, if it is a 4-unit or 4-bedroom single-family home, then the maximum subsidy for a person is going to be 1/4 of that payment standard for a 4-bedroom home. And last requirements are that the shared housing rent, including the utilities, must be both reasonable in comparison to similar shared housing arrangements elsewhere in that community, and they must be affordable. And affordable means that if the rent, including utilities, at initial occupancy exceeds the payment standard, the unit cannot be approved for a subsidy if the tenant's portion exceeds 40% of monthly adjusted income. So if the tenant's portion exceeds 40%, then the unit will be deemed unaffordable, because when people pay upwards of 40% of their monthly income toward rent, they are typically in very precarious housing situations, and are at much higher risk of eviction because the rent's not affordable. Now let's talk about an example of shared housing. And our prime example is the Life homes that are located near George Mason University in Fairfax. So these homes are typically a 3 to 4 bedroom single family home, and the residents are 2 to 3 adults with developmental disability plus a resident assistant who provides those informal supports. Now, some or even all of the residents with disabilities may have SRAP rental subsidies. And often in these arrangements, one of those residents will ask that the resident assistant be able to serve as their live-in aide in the state rental assistance program. And that will allow us to provide a subsidy for both that resident and the live-in aide. Next, the landlord typically executes separate leases with each renter or each tenant. Now remember, the services like lawn care and housekeeping aren't going to be included in the rent, and that's frankly what helps keep the rent within the program's payment standard, so it can be the unit can be approved. However, renters can agree to purchase these services or perform them on their own, or perhaps with the support of their family or outside sources. And last but not least, if needed, renters can bring their own supports to supplement the informal supports that the resident assistant provides. So sometimes this will be waiver services like personal assistance services or in-home supports or independent living supports. Other times it's going to be natural supports like family, siblings, people in the community who stop by. And sometimes it will be supports that the family privately pays for. So now let's turn to our last creative housing approach, and this is about family-owned rental housing. So what is family-owned rental housing? Well, it's when a family member of a person with a developmental disability owns a rental unit and agrees to lease that unit to a person with a developmental disability. Now, housing choice voucher programs may allow participants to rent units owned by family members, but it will be necessary to obtain or request rather a reasonable accommodation from the housing choice voucher program, because typically it is not allowable for an individual or a renter to rent from somebody who's directly related to them. However, if there's a disability related reason for needing to rent from somebody who is a family member, the voucher program will consider that under a reasonable accommodation request. However, in the state rental assistance program, participants are permitted to rent units owned by family members as long as the owner, that means the family member, does not occupy the unit. So in SRAP, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt and uncle could rent a unit to an individual with DD and be approved for the rent subsidy as long as that aunt, uncle, grandparent, parent is not occupying the same unit as the person with DD. So, the way this will work is the state rental assistance program will provide a subsidy based on the household size. So, if it is one person renting the unit, they will get a subsidy that will cover a one-bedroom rent. If that one person, if the unit that's available, that the family is making available, is a two-bedroom and it's only one person, then the subsidy that will be approved is a one-bedroom subsidy, even in a two-bedroom unit. It's also important to know that rent plus utilities cannot exceed that affordable rent and reasonable rent that we talked about a little bit ago. So let's talk about the benefits and disadvantages of family-owned rental housing. One of the key benefits is that when a family makes its rental housing that it owns available to a person with a developmental disability, that unit can typically be customized to meet the individual's disability-related needs. So this often will happen when a family renovates a unit to make it physically accessible for a person who uses a wheelchair, or inserts technology into the unit to assist people with sensory or cognitive disabilities, things like that. It's also a benefit that the individual is almost guaranteed a supportive landlord, because that family has made that unit available to that person because they really want to see that person being housed. The family, as the landlord, is going to collect a reliable subsidy to offset unit expenses, such as the mortgage, the insurance, repairs, real estate taxes, things like that. And if the mortgage on that unit is paid off, any net income from this rental could be placed in a special needs trust or ABLE account, which could then fund other disability-related needs that might be for food, or that might be for recreation, or for other types of supportive services, things like that. Now let's talk about disadvantages. So it's really critical to understand that if you are a family member and you want to make rental housing available, it's going to be a lot of work, because landlording is a lot of work. And it's really critical to understand that there is going to be additional process when you introduce a rental assistance program. So there's going to be paperwork, unit inspections, contracts, and you'll have to report the rental income. So this is taking on a pretty hefty amount of work. Another disadvantage is the subsidy may not cover 100% of the expenses to operate the rental unit that you've made available. So for example, remember when we talked about if you are renting to one individual, but you're renting a two-bedroom unit, that individual will be approved for a one-bedroom subsidy. So it's very possible that you will not get 100% of your mortgage covered, or 100% of your real estate taxes and insurance, things like that. So you're going to have to make sure that there are funds available to cover those other costs so that you can keep that rental unit maintained and operable. So let's talk about the different approaches that you might use to making family-owned rental housing available. So the first approach is when a family member may decide that they want to move out of the home that they currently live in. Maybe they're downsizing, maybe they're relocating, but they don't sell that home. They instead decide to rent that original home to a person with a developmental disability. Now, in some cases, the family may choose to pay off that mortgage all at once, or in other cases, they may choose to pay down the mortgage over time, especially if they have a really good interest rate. The second approach is the family may decide to purchase a new home for the benefit of a person with a developmental disability using financing that has special eligibility guidelines, such as the Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac Family Opportunity Mortgage. Now, the way that this mortgage financing program works is Fannie and Freddie basically consider the parent the owner-occupant of the dwelling if their disabled adult child cannot work, or has insufficient income to qualify for a mortgage on their own. So this is basically giving the parents permission to purchase a second home, but instead of classifying it as an investment property, Fannie and Freddie classify the property as a primary residence. And that enables the family that is the borrower to get a much lower interest rate. And instead of having to pay a much higher down payment of 20 to 30%, they'll get the opportunity to put only 3 to 5% down as a down payment. Now, in either of these two scenarios, the family could choose to put the home in a third-party special needs trust, and that would enable them to protect that property for the benefit of the person with a disability. And when that home is no longer able to be used by the person, it could be disposed of in such a way that there will be no Medicaid payback required. That means that the trustee would not be required to sell the house and pay Medicaid back for any expenditures that Medicaid has covered regarding the person's health care or their long-term home and community-based services. So how does the process work to make family-owned rental housing available to a person? So this is about 6 steps, and the first step is that the individual has to apply for a housing choice voucher or state rental assistance. And at that time of application, you want to make sure that if it's a housing choice voucher program, they will agree to administer rental assistance in shared housing. Assuming they do, then the family is going to complete the landlord paperwork to qualify the unit for either the housing choice voucher program or the state rental assistance program. That paperwork consists of things like a request for tenancy approval, which basically provides information about the unit that is being considered for rent. They'll have to complete a tenancy addendum to the lease that explains the landlord's and the participant's responsibility in the housing choice voucher or state rental assistance program. They'll have to fill out a W-9 because that rental income will be reported to the IRS as rental income to the landlord. The family as landlord will complete a direct deposit form if that housing program does direct deposit. And they're going to have to submit rent reasonableness documentation, basically documentation of other units that are in the area that are of a similar size, age, building type, number of bedrooms and bathrooms, things like that, to verify that the rent that the family is charging is reasonable and compared to other similar types of units in the community. And last but not least, the family will have to submit documentation of ownership of that unit. For example, a real estate tax assessment or a property deed. Next, if the housing agency reviews these documents and approves the unit's rent, it will arrange a housing quality standards inspection, which is basically a safety inspection for housing. If that safety inspection passes, the landlord, meaning the family, and the tenant will sign a lease and provide a copy to the housing agency. The housing agency will in turn send the landlord a housing choice voucher or state rental assistance program contract to sign. Once that contract is signed, the housing agency will receive a signed copy, and then they will initiate the subsidy payment from the voucher or state rental assistance program. So let's kind of walk through an example of a family that made family-owned rental housing available to their adult child with this disability. And our example today is Caitlin. So Caitlin is on the DD waiver waitlist, but she has a CCC Plus waiver that includes or enables her to get 56 hours of personal assistance. Plus she gets county-funded self-directed supports to assist her with meaningful day activities. Caitlin is living in a 2-bedroom condominium that her parents own. That condominium was originally a condominium purchased for her grandmother, and when her grandmother passed away, Caitlin's mom said, well, rather than selling this condo, why don't we make it available for Caitlin? So they chose to do that. So they had Caitlin apply for SRAP, and Caitlin was approved for a rent subsidy. Caitlin asked the SRAP program for a reasonable accommodation for a live-in aide to stay overnight and provide her assistance at night and in the late evening and early morning before the CCC Plus care attendant arrives. So Caitlin is now living in the 2-bedroom condo that her parents own. She has a live-in aide who stays with her overnight, and she gets her paid services during the day from the personal attendant and the day support activity programs. And she has a rent subsidy to help pay the rent, which is basically offsetting the cost of the mortgage, real estate taxes, and other things that her parents pay on that condo to make that condo available to her. All right, now it's going to be time for questions and answers. I'm going to show you quickly before we begin to open the lines some contact information for folks that you may want to follow up with in your community if you have specific questions about your own particular circumstances.
I introduced our regional housing coordinators at the beginning of this presentation. This map shows each of the areas included in a region and is defined by the colors as shown. Green is Region 1, Western Virginia, and Marie Fraticelli covers this area. Yellow is Region 2, Northern Virginia, and Jeannie Cummins Eisenhower covers this area. Orange is Region 3, Southwestern Virginia, and Anna Bowman covers this area. Gray is Region 4, Central Virginia, and Cherie Hilliard-Jones covers this area. And blue is Region 5, Eastern Virginia, and it's covered by Kim Rogers.
You can see it a little more clearly. Here's our contact information. And I'll leave that up while we open the phone lines so that we can have some questions and answers. You're welcome to either chat in your questions and answers, or we'll try to open the lines so that you can ask them directly.